ladies and gentlemen, and transgender people, what I will attempt to do with the talk today is to somehow present to you a way into the thought of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in relationship to photography. So this is not the kind of talk that that gives you a general introduction, or as one of these kind of how to read Deleuze. This is not that kind of thing. It is a very practical attempt to identify several traits in the thought of Deleuze and Guattari that we will be able to use in order to make photography actually work. Yeah? Now you might say, well, why, if it's not broken, why fix it? But I will put to you that it is broken, and you broke it. So you will have to fix it. Okay. So I'm kind of taking, not at random, but I'm taking three entry points, three journeys which are interrelated into the thought of Deleuze and Guattari. One of them is in their writing called the plane of immanence, and in relation to photography, I define it as becoming invisible. The other, Deleuze and Guattari will refer to generally as the rhizome, and I think of it photographically as mise en abîme, or somehow placing photography in between haunted mirrors. Hello. So this second move, the haunted mirror move, is around, instead of saying that photography is a mirror of the world, I propose that through Deleuze we can say it's photography itself which is placed between two mirrors, yeah, and endlessly reflecting between the two in the kind of mise en abîme move. And the third journey into this thought is defined by Deleuze and Guattari as the refrain, and I will call it repetition. So for the becoming invisible, the image that I hope will help to somehow relate to this thought is this very famous Erased Beckoning by Rauschenberg. And this is an image of a drawing that is becoming invisible. So what is at stake when we think about photography becoming invisible? It is about asking what will be left of the photograph if we remove all content. Now you might ask, why would I want to do that? And it's a good question, and I hope to answer it later on. But what will be left of the photograph if we remove all content, if we remove all associations with language, with semiotics, with signification? What is left? Maybe nothing is left, but then you will want to ask, what kind of nothing is it? But perhaps something is left. So in the case of Rauschenberg's Erased Beckoning, something is indeed left, and it almost points to this idea that the gesture of erasure has to precede the gesture of inscription. Before you can inscribe something, you need to erase first. A bit like, you know, if you have a wax tablet and you write on it, if you want to write again, you first need to erase what is written. So perhaps there is a similar gesture with photography. So that allows you to somehow complicate the notion of the image, to move it away from this simplistic relationship between image, object, referent, and all that. So the second journey I indicated, the mise en abîme, this image supposed to bring it to mind, the haunted mirrors. Obviously, this is an installation, and the way I use photography here is in the most nasty representational way. Just live with it. That's the best I could do. And finally, in order to get you to think about repetition as the gesture of photography, this is Victor Di Maria? Walter de Maria. This is Walter de Maria's amazing installation of 1,000 lightning rods in Arizona desert. And what happens is that these lightning rods are installed in the desert, and when on a stormy night, lightning just hits these rods, creating this image. And for me, it is really quite important, because I think that really captures something really essential about photography, because it draws your attention to the power of the exposure itself. And exposure is not something we can archive or valorize or sell or frame, but at the same time you could say, well, that is the most photographic of photography. And the interesting thing about exposure is that it has no content of its own, but it has this ability to be endlessly repeated. So there is a suggestion here in this third way into their thought, that if you just allow to consider photography from the perspective of its production, of its labor, of the actual praxis of making, then you will really have to address the way it is disseminated, the way it is distributed, the way it is kind of spread. And this ability to spread, of being disseminated, of being somehow repeated, is unique to the photographic image. And you could say that this ability to be repeated in itself has a certain meaning, because it has a rhythm to it. And rhythm is a physical sensation. It has a certain temporality to it. It has a certain way to inhabit duration. You know, for instance, when you walk, then you are in a particular rhythm. And this rhythm creates certain experience, certain affect, which is very different from the fact that you are walking to the shop to buy a pint of milk. Yeah, that might be the goal of the walk, but the walk itself also has certain way of becoming for you. So these are these three journeys that I will try to kind of outline. So in brief, they are becoming invisible, the haunted image, and this music of repetition. So why these three slightly torturous attempts to renegotiate the relationship with photography? It is because what Deleuze and Guattari attempt to do is to bring photography closer to the way it is practiced in the everyday, in the real life. I have to pause here for a second, and there is a little disclaimer coming up. Deleuze and Guattari didn't actually write about photography. Yeah, they did not understand photography. With all my love to them, I have to say, it is their blind spot. It's not unusual for philosophers to have a blind spot. Yeah, Descartes had a blind spot when he said, "I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am." His blind spot was this little I. And Kant later pointed out that in order to have an I, you need to be in certain time and space. You need to already have a certain relationship to various temporal and spatial dimensions. And for that reason, these categories of time and space have to come before thinking, even before doubt. But even later on, for instance, in Henry Bergson's wonderful writing on cinema, for Bergson, the film apparatus, the cine camera, is a kind of technical imitation of the human eye, and he laments this industrialization of vision. And then when Deleuze comes to the scene and writes his books on cinema, Cinema 1, the space image, and Cinema 2, the time image, he points out that for Bergson, the camera was a mechanical eye. But he says, well, Bergson misses a point here. The whole point is not that the camera is kind of simplified and mechanized human vision. The camera allows you access to non-human vision, because it allows you to look at a scene from different perspectives at once. You can have a kind of multiplicity of views on a single event. And that kind of takes you out of the human subjectivity. So Deleuze identified this gap in Bergsonian thinking that allowed him to suggest that cinema takes you beyond human vision. You know, later on, people like Catherine Hayles developed it under the rubric of the post-human. But it starts with this reconfiguration as the apparatus. But Deleuze himself, I put to you, also had a blind spot around photography. For Deleuze and Guattari, photography is a very mechanical photocopying gesture of taking something and copying it, and there is really nothing much to it. They're much more interested in literature, in theater, in even mime, in mime, as very rich forms of artistic expression that have many dimensionalities to them. But photography for Deleuze and Guattari is very one-dimensional. It just takes something and repeats. So that's the mistake in D&G, which I am going to fix today. And I think it is quite interesting also to notice how in misunderstanding photography like this, Deleuze and Guattari join a very long line of highly regarded and important philosophers who just did not get photography. Adorno is one of them. And probably it will be easier just to name the few who did get photography, and I will tell you straight away. Walter Benjamin got it, but not in his famous work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, when he sets up a very simplistic opposition between the mechanically reproduced image and the aura of the work of art, but more in his writing on translation, his essays on Baudelaire, and in his big The Arcades. Wilhelm Flusser got it, right? And a number of others which I will mention later. But it is quite interesting how difficult it is to really grasp what is happening with photography. And somehow people tend to think that photography is this one thing. It is an image of something. And I think it's very peculiar why we allow most other things to have many dimensions. Even, for instance, something like a fountain. I mean a normal fountain, not Duchamp's installation, but a normal fountain. It has a shape because there is this water coming out. It has a sound because there is kind of water falling on the ground. It has several layers. You can cool by its shade. You can drink from it. But photography is somehow not allowed to have any of that. It's just supposed to do this one thing, to be an image of something. So I want to try to get into this problem and to identify it as specifically political problem. Okay, so going back to the question, why photography needs fixing? As I said, it is about bringing it closer to the conditions of the real world. And what do we mean by these conditions of the real world? Well, if you just look at your life, which is split roughly 50-50 between online and offline, between moving your physical body in a physical space sometimes, and other times moving some shapes on the screen of the computer. So how do these things relate to each other? So clearly part of our life we spent in a chronological linear temporality and in a three-dimensional space, and part of our time we spent in a very different space. It follows a very different logic, a space in which once you upload something online, it is available instantly everywhere. Yeah, that's not what happens in space. When I put this bottle on the table, it just tends to stay there. It doesn't just go everywhere. But online, things don't work in that way. Yeah, and online you can also be in a face-to-face communication with someone who is not only in a different time zone, even in a different day. They can be a day behind you. Yeah, so that already introduces a very different this idea that we inhabit two worlds all at once. What is strange is that we don't experience it as strange. That is the really amazing thing about it, how quickly we adjusted to see that as normal. But in fact, it is really mind-blowingly bizarre that part of our life is spent in a very different relationship to space and time. Yeah. So how to bring photography closer to reflect on these particular conditions of contemporary existence? But even taking it a step further, this strange world we inhabit deals with us in many ways. Part of them are visual, you know, and we have surveillance cameras and you know, the whole kind of visual trappings of the disciplinary society, which, you know, we know and love. On the other hand, there is also another edifice which is constructed from data mining, from data shadows, from even kind of affective considerations when you end up buying a car, not on the basis of how fast it goes, but how many tactile surfaces it has. Yeah? So how can you reflect on that photographically? How can you reflect through photography on the way life is so much bigger than what can be experienced or addressed visually? Yeah? Because perhaps we could simplify and say the 20th century was a very visual century. Everything was done through the eye. Michel Foucault addressed that famously in his writings on the Panopticon, and many students did projects about it ever since. But we kind of moved on from that situation into something much more complex, when instead of panoptic societies and surveillance, there is something much more fluid that deals with data in very subtle ways, that deals with coercing us into modes of behavior, not because we are surveyed, but in ways which are much harder to understand. So you can have a building that is organized in a way that encourages certain meetings between people, and has certain points for mingling, and it's designed in a way that will encourage, for instance, cross-fertilization between different professionals. And many universities and laboratories around the world are designed with particular aims like this in mind, to facilitate certain communications through the way the architecture influences the actual content that is being created. So again, how can photography deal with this really changing world made of fuzzy logic, artificial intelligence, holographic gaming, you know, speeds which are close to the speed of light? If photography cannot deal with all of these things, then what is its fate? Is it on the way to go to the British Museum to assume its place next to the surgical instruments from the 18th century? Or does it have a role to play in this decentered, expansive environment that does not seem to operate according to the logic of thing and image, object and referent, than Deleuze and Guattari are trying to address? So that's how we're going to get into the problem. We start from looking at this image. So, are you still okay? Do you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So in the first instance, the thought of Deleuze and Guattari is about very simple things. The simplest things are those things which are the closest to us. That which is the closest to us is also the hardest to notice. So the thought of Deleuze and Guattari can be very difficult, but not because it is removed or esoteric. It is difficult because it is the closest. So take this image, for instance. So the content of this image, the content is this toaster. you can replace this toaster with another thing, with a kettle, for instance, and it will not change anything. However, if you remove the frame, everything will change. So this is the first kind of little experiment to try to establish what an image is. And it's also a kind of advice about the whole talk, the whole seminar that we're having here now. It's better to think about the frame, the way the whole talk is framed, rather than the individual detail, because the detail can be interchangeable, they can be replaced with something else. It is the framework that really matters. So, here is a question. What is the difference between the toaster on this screen and the toaster in your kitchen? Now, if your answer is that the toaster in your kitchen is real and the toaster on the screen is not, then I will suggest politely that your notion of reality is a little bit anorexic. The difference is not that the toaster in your kitchen can make toast and this one cannot. Because you can have a broken toast that cannot make toast, and that does not make it into an image. Yeah? So what makes something into an image? Okay. Something becomes an image when it has a frame. A frame makes something into an image. If you don't believe me, I suggest that when you go home, take a frame, put it around your toaster, and see what happens. The moment you put your frame around your toaster, it will be an image, even if it still makes toast. When you remove the frame, it is still the toaster again. So, this is very fundamental. And the reason it is important is because that suggests how it is possible to think about images in a materialist way, rather than idealistically. In idealism, you see, there is a glass-cut distinction between things and images. This distinction goes back to the ancient Greeks, to the thought of Plato, and it was refined later on by Descartes and reappropriated as a distinction between the body and the mind. And, you know, it's one of the tenets of Western thinking. I'm going to show you later on how this way of thinking has its own political investments. Yeah? But it's important to realize that this is a very particular philosophy you subscribe to when you say that the image and the thing are completely different. And this is really the problem with the traditional understanding of photography. It operates according to the principle of the deep cut. There is a deep cut between the thing and the image. They cannot occupy the same place, the same space at the same time. You can either have the image or the thing. The image can never be the thing. The thing is not the image. They are completely separate. That will cause some problems. So what I'm proposing here, and when I say I'm proposing, I am really presenting the Deleuze-Guattarian materialist philosophy, which is aimed squarely against Platonism, but also against psychoanalysis and against dialectical Marxism. What they propose is that if you want to have materialist relationship to the image, you need to think about the frame. The frame creates the meaning. The frame is the framework. Okay. So, I think we covered that quite clearly. I'm pleased with that. Okay, now, let me just, before we go any further, let me briefly discuss the political investment of shifting the attention from the content of the image to the frame. Every political system operates through a principle of enframing or a framework. For instance, I will give you a very clear-cut example, a nasty example. In the Nazi Germany, the politics of Nazi Germany was framed through the question of race. Yeah? Your own meaning, once you were inside the frame of the Nazi, of the Third Reich, your own meaning, your own reaching to the world, your own destiny was determined by this framing of race. It was absolutely clear-cut. In a sense, it was, you could say, beautiful, because it operated with such precision and clarity. The frame of race was so sharply defined that whether you were a Jew or a homosexual or a gypsy, you had to carry the frame with you, so you would wear a yellow star. That is the mark of the framing, of the political framing. An unrelated example is that, for instance, in Israel, there is another framing at work. In modern Israel, the question of whether you are a Jew or not determines fully your reach into the world, down even to the amount of water you can get from the local authority. Yeah, it is determined by the, so the whole political discourse is determined by the question of the frame. We will come back to that in about 10 minutes to show why it is like that. But so far, I just want to summarize where we arrived with our understanding of the problem. So far, we established that there is no distinction between images and things. They are only things. Images are things with meaning. Meaning is established through framing. Framing is a question of politics. Yeah? Now, that might sound really quite strange to you, but that's okay. If you think about it for a second, think about the world outside your consciousness. Outside of your sphere of thinking, the world is a chaotic mess made of molecules and strands of DNA and atoms. They just bang into each other and create some things chaotically that sometimes gel and sometimes not. But your consciousness is organized in such a way that it knows how to frame this chaos through notions of space and time in a way that gives them meaning and continuity and purpose. Yeah? Not because the world somehow has a purpose. Yeah? We know that it doesn't, sorry to say. But I didn't come here to make friends. But the world has no purpose. Okay. But it appears that it does, because that's how our consciousness tends to deal with all this mass of things. It's the same with images. The world of things is just the world of things. When you put a frame around something, this whatever is framed becomes meaningful. With my students, we do this lovely exercise, which you're free to try, or you can try it later at home. Make a frame with your fingers and frame something, and you will immediately notice that whatever is in the frame somehow acquires a certain meaning. Only what is in the frame has meaning. What is not in the frame is completely meaningless, ipso facto. Okay. Are you okay so far? So, that is the first takeaway. All right. Now, just before we move on, I just wanted to say that we are moving now to discuss more specifically the question of representation in relation to photography. So, here is a quotation from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So you see what is at stake here. And it's from his Confessions. In his old age, Rousseau sits in his study and writes the Confessions, and he says there, well, I'm going into a camera obscura. I don't really need to write a book as such. I'm just going to make a record of whatever I see. Yeah? Okay. notice how familiar this way of understanding the photographic apparatus is to us. Yeah? And what is, I think, interesting here is that old Jean-Jacques is the father of modern representational democracy. He single-handedly invented the contemporary political order, yeah, and the French Revolution into the bargain. So now, in Rousseau's writings about representation in the political context, when he writes about elected representatives, he is fully aware that elected representatives may and will distort the will of the people. He understands that political representation is always a distortion. Yeah? But it's very curious that he is unable to apply the same understanding of representation in relation to the camera obscura. For him, the camera obscura is this unproblematic photocopying. You see something, you trace it, you get an image. Yeah? So you see why when I say that Deleuze and Guattari got it all wrong about photography, they have a precedent. There is a whole lineage of people who get it wrong about photography. In a short while, I will try to explain why that is happening. But for now, we can just stay with this understanding. Okay, so what is photographic representation? How are we going to understand it in a way that will allow us to connect political representation with photographic representation? So I'm going to tell you a little story which I stole from Heidegger, and he stole it from Hegel. And the story is like that. I adapted it slightly, as you will probably guess. Someone wants to find out what is representation. So they go into a photographic gallery and ask to be shown representation. So they are shown landscapes and still lifes, portraits and interiors. They are offered migrant mothers in their tents. They are offered derelict buildings with grass growing through the cracks. They are offered middle-aged couples sitting on sofas and awkward teenagers looking wistfully into the middle distance. They are offered all that, but they reject all that is offered. They absolutely want to see representation. And yet, it seems, representation cannot be shown. So, maybe I should ask you now, what is representation? Well, maybe it's not a fair question. Maybe asking a room full of photography students what is representation is like asking a group of dancers what is gravity. Because, gravity is pretty important for dancing, but I imagine that you can be a pretty good dancer without knowing the first thing about Isaac Newton. However, what is the name of the political system we are so fortunate to inhabit? Is it called gravitational democracy? Sadly not. It's called representational democracy. For that reason, the question of representation is not just an idle question. It really goes to the heart of what, as photographers, as students of this craft, we're supposed to be really thinking about. Yeah? So the most thought-provoking question is why we are not thinking about representation. So, what is representation? Now, I think that if you've been paying attention to the talk up to this point, you will know the answer. I will give it to you. Representation is a framework. It is the way something is framed. That is slightly at odds with the way people normally conceive. Well, I say normally, I mean, I encountered some people, which I will not name, who think that representation is just something, well, almost like gravity, something which is just, that's how the world is known. However, if you think about representation as a framework, then you will have to admit that frameworks are not naturally occurring things. Frameworks are established, yeah? And the representational framework is a particular technology that was designed or devised in order to solve a very specific problem. Okay, what problem representation came to solve? The problem was how to get out of slavery, how to get out of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, the so-called the Dark Ages, lasted for 1,000 years in Europe, from roughly 400 AC to 1400 AC. And during this time, the sun was shining. But we call it the Dark Ages. Why? We call it Dark Ages because it had a very particular framework around it. Do you know what was the main technology of the Middle Ages? It was not plowing with an ox. It was not chivalry. The technology of the Middle Ages was called Christianity, religion. That was the very ground. That was the technology that allowed you to get to knowledge. That's how you knew whatever there was to know. You knew it by going to the scriptures. Yeah? The scriptures were the word of God, and if you wanted knowledge, you went to the book, to the good book, and you studied. And you know, the first universities in Europe, that was their aim. They were mechanisms to increase knowledge by studying the scriptures. And in the 14th century, if you went to Bologna or to Paris to study at a university, you would be a doctor of theology, which is not the same as becoming a priest. It's completely different. It is the secular way of getting to knowledge through the scriptures. Yeah? Now, that's a very powerful mechanism. There was a lot of knowledge gathered during these 1,000 years of the Middle Ages through this framework of religion. Yeah? So knowledge was great, but it had some nasty aspects to it as well. Like, for instance, you were normally chained to a post, or, you know, you wouldn't be allowed to go anywhere without permission, and you were generally someone's slave or a serf. So that was not so great. Now, when the Middle Ages started to kind of come to an end, a new technology appeared. What was required is a device to get out of this framework of religion. And what was the new framework that people erected instead? People like Galileo and Newton, but also people like Leibniz and Spinoza, and mostly Immanuel Kant, whom we already mentioned. Their idea was to replace the framework of religion with the framework of reason. So now reason became the ground on which knowledge could be based. Because if you just take away the framework of religion, then how do you get to knowledge? How do you know anything if you take away God? You need something else. You need something to come instead. And the thing that came instead is called reason. Yeah? And Immanuel Kant gets into this whole question in this essay, What is Enlightenment?, in which he proposes a certain little battle cry with which he said we can break away from this serfdom of the Middle Ages. And this battle cry in Latin is sapere aude, dare to know. And what it means is it's a challenge. Dare to know by yourself. Dare to know on your own, not through God, not because the priest told you, not because it says so in the Bible. Dare to figure it out for yourself. Now, why it is possible to figure things out for yourself? It is possible because you are a rational human being. Because you are a rational human being, you can learn, you can know about the world. Because you are rational, You can learn about the world because you can represent the world to yourself. You can know the world as a representation because you possess reason. Because you possess reason, you can also be taken out of the bondage of slavery. Because as a reasonable human being, as a reasonable white male, we should say, as a reasonable white male, you can elect your own representatives. If you are unreasonable, if you are mad, for instance, then you cannot do that. And that's why, as Foucault beautifully explained, at the moment when the age of reason happens, also the first asylums for the mad happen. Because in order to have reason, you also need to have madness. Before, in the Middle Ages, you didn't need to have this distinction. So, by situating reason as the ground, three things happened. It became possible to learn about the world as a representation. It was possible to acquire political autonomy through representational democracy, not all at once, but that was kind of the journey. And it was possible to replace bartering in the marketplace with the representational system of money. Okay? So what we have on the table now are three things. It is knowledge through representation, which is science, modern science as we know it. It is democracy as the politics of modernity, and it is capitalism as the economy of modernity. And all these three things hinge on representation. They only made possible because representation becomes the ground. Yeah? Now this is a very boiled down to a kind of space food summary of quite a complex journey that could take in, you know, the changes in optics in the Renaissance and the way perspective became the primal modality of knowing the world visually. But I'm not going to get into all that because I just wanted to explain to you why representation is such a key thing and how interesting it is that photography plays a very particular role in this triumvirate of knowledge, politics, and economy. Photography seems to be the aesthetic piece of the puzzle. It fits in by establishing representation as an aesthetic proof, not economic, not democratic, not one of knowledge, but one of aesthetics. And it seems that in this way, photography plays this absolutely crucial part in validating capitalism, scientific knowledge, and democracy. For that reason, the question of what representation means to you is, I think, quite an important one. So what does it mean in practice? It basically means, and I'm really slashing here to the very essence, it means that photography that takes representation as a given immediately reaffirms the existing order of rational science, which might not be such a tragedy, yeah, after all, you know, some good things happen to science, but it at the same time reaffirms the order of democracy, and here opinions may vary, and it also reaffirms the order of capitalism. All these three things are being subliminally reaffirmed every time you make a photograph that takes representation as its modus operandi. Yeah. Now, this is a disturbing thought because you might be a very well-meaning individual and you want to make the world a better place by photographing poor people, and you will go and you will take pictures of homeless people sleeping in the doorway of harems. So you even have a little bit of dialectics going on there, you know. But it does not matter. The very act of doing it reaffirms this hierarchical order of representation. It accepts without questioning the implicit power of representation over you. Just as every time you go to the shop and you pass over a 10-pound note and you get in return 2 pints of milk and a loaf of bread, you also reaffirm the order of financial exchange. Yeah? And there is no way out of it. Now think about it in this way. Let's stay with this example of giving some 10-pound note in return for a certain service or some goods. Yeah? In what way it is exactly like photography? Because this is a symbolic exchange. You know, it's quite easy to realize that if you take the same 10-pound note to another culture where they maybe don't have money, or they have a bartering system, they will look at it and say, well, that is not worth 2 loaves of bread and 2 pints of milk, and I can give you another piece of paper in return, but you know, that's as far as I will go with it. Because without the pre-existing, externally given, hierarchical order that validates this exchange, this piece of paper is really nothing. Okay, now, stay with me and try to realize that with photography it is the same thing. But no, but photographs, they look like that. You know, how can it be different? But, you know, it's just like coming to someone in the Middle Ages and telling them, look, you don't need to believe in God. And then they will say, but then what is there left? You know, how the world will continue moving for 1 more second. You cannot step out of your frame. Stepping out of this framing is incredibly difficult. When you were in the Middle Ages, you could only be on a certain scale between a sinner and a saint. And that's it. You couldn't step out of it. You could become a heretic that would still keep you in a relationship to religion, but you couldn't step out of it and say, well, you know, I'm kind of not taking part in any of that. I'm just kind of want to live my own life. I want to be, you know, a single mother, or a, you know, I want to multitask. You couldn't do this kind of things. The framework is unchallengeable, unquestionable, because it is invisible. What you don't see, you cannot question. And that's why I told you that the thought of Deleuze and Guattari is about the things which are so close to us that we cannot see. So they basically provoke us to ask, what is our enframing? We can obviously laugh at the stupid people from the Middle Ages that believe in God. But what we believe in, their answer in these 2 volumes, Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plateaus, is that we believe in representation. For us, representation truly replaced faith. And stepping out of it is just as difficult. However, art has a way of sometimes getting us there. Yeah? But so far, I think, I'm sorry to say, photography did not really manage to do it. And it is partly, I blame the photographic literature for that. I think mostly because it is generally applying to photography the same model it expects photography to apply to the world. Yeah. So you know, all these books, you know, and again, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but all these books, like, you know, what is for thinking photography and on photography and camera lucida and all that, they all start from a kind of notion of what photography is. Then they go around and discovering that actually it is what we thought from the beginning that it is. So they basically apply to photography the same, they stay within the same representational framework. They represent photography. And of course, because they represent photography, the only thing they find in photography is representation. Yeah? And I have particular problem with camera lucida in this regard, but it is really not nothing you know, that you couldn't say about any of the other books. But when, you know, it is really surprising when someone comes and reads camera lucida in order to find out about photography, because it is really like reading Robinson Crusoe to find out about survival on a desert island. Robinson Crusoe is clearly a work of fiction. It's an unreliable source if you want to learn about survival. Why think that Camera Lucida is different? Because to my mind, it fails the first criterion for a book of philosophy. Not only fails, it declares from the start it's not. Because it says, I'm not interested, on page 8, I think, of the book, Barth says, I'm not interested in production. He says, I want to learn about photography, but then I had several avenues to me, but one of them I just was completely disinterested. I'm not a photographer, too impatient for that. Don't go into the darkroom. Cannot stand it. So I'm only interested in photography from the perspective of the consumer and the connoisseur, which is fine, because he is absolutely clear about it. I have no problem with Barth. I have problem with all the generations of people who somehow tend to ignore it and then go to his book to find out about photography. Well, it's exactly like going to, if let's say Barth would decide, Professor Barth would decide to write a book about capitalism, and we'll call it Lucid Capital. We'll say, well, here is a book about capitalism. However, I was interested in the commodities. I like them, and they're beautiful, and I like buying them, but I was not really bothered with all the production aspect of it. Too impatient for doing things, not my cup of tea. So would you take a book about capitalism that brackets out everything to do with production as a valid source? Well, you might, if you have a particular ideological investments. But for the same reasons, you also might reject it as really one-sided. And it is interesting how this suspicion of photographic practice runs so incredibly deep in writing about photography. And I think it is really, really interesting, because so many books speak about the various desirous investments in the image. The image is a site of passions and tragedies, and Sontag writes about these images from Buchenwald and how her life was never the same. So all the image is a site of all these emotions and passions and affairs and intensities. However, when it comes to the darkroom, everyone fell silent. Not a word is being spoken. As if in the darkroom there are no desires. As if in the production, in the labor, there are no passions. As if it is already assumed that what is happening in the darkroom is a kind of automatic one-to-one transfer from the film to the print. But what if that is not the case? What if the darkroom is precisely the site where all these emotional roller coasters are taking place? What if the darkroom is the site of desirous agency? Yeah, that is a quite an interesting thought, because then it might suggest first the whole idea of indexicality as some kind of uninterrupted, apron string that connects you with the object. What Barth is saying about it, he basically, but he had an issue with apron strings, didn't he? So he is saying that this image here and this event there, they kind of connected, and nothing can break this connection. It is sort of uninterrupted. But if you go to the darkroom, you realize that it's very interruptible. Loads of things can go wrong. Loads of things can happen. Passion can act out. You can boil your developer. You can forget about it. You can get all different messy things, if you just allow the process to come into the fore. And actually, isn't that what Marx suggests we do when he says that we should really try to pay a little bit more attention to praxis? Okay, so where did we stray? And how are we doing for time? Questions soon. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else. If there's some last mails. Okay. Now let's go back then to the very first images. Okay. So So we had an opportunity to try to understand that in order to engage with photography in a meaningful way which is fit for the contemporary modern age, if we want to step out of this idealistic framework, image, thing, image, if we want to basically get out of Platonism in relation to photography, we need to pay attention to the way the image is framed. The image is framed through the technology of representation. Technology is something that is very pertinent to our age, isn't it? Yeah? So this is Dolly the sheep. Dolly the sheep? So what is technology for Dolly the sheep? Technology for Dolly the sheep is not the remote control of the TV set. It is the very thing that gives it life. Yeah? So at least for some creatures on this planet, technology is life. Now, if for some of us technology is life, it is not unreasonable that it is quite life-giving to the rest of us as well. Yeah? So engaging with the technologies of production, engaging with the things which are outside of the image, which are left when you remove the content of the image, could be really the source of establishing some political agency to photography. Yeah? And that will be a very different vision of photography, very different from the way media studies want you to think about it. It will allow you to think about photography as the expression, as the visual manifestation of the philosophical thought of this kind of radical materialism that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about. It will also allow you to realize that this notion of identity, this notion of correspondence between the image and the thing, as if there is some kind of truth game being played between the image and the thing, this relationship, which is posited on the notion of identity, is itself already deeply steeped in ideology, in the ideology of representation, which I, in a very brief shorthand, identified as related to capitalism and rationality. So going back to the three journeys D&G offer into the question of photography. So I think the becoming invisible is really the key here. Everything else follows from it. What does it mean, the becoming invisible? To me, it really is about paying attention to something like the latent image, the hidden, invisible image that is formed on film after exposure and kept in this dark slide or a canister. Yeah? Then later on we pour in some developer and we make a picture that we can look at. Okay, so we do something to this image in order to make it anthropologically valid, in order to make it accessible to the human eye. But what about this invisible image? It seems that it is really photography in its more kind of pure, true sense. Before photography is translated in a way that, or processed in a way that the human can relate to it, it exists in a sort of pre-human dimension. Now remember what I told you earlier about the way Deleuze corrected Bergson around the notion of the film camera by saying that the film camera is not a mechanized human eye. It is the possibility of looking at the world through non-human eyes. Well, it is possible to suggest that this latent image, if we only take it seriously, allows us the possibility of considering some kind of considering an image which is not for human eyes. And if we look around us today, most of the images in the world today are images not for human eyes. Yeah? And I will just finish on a very brief observation about images. When you go, for instance, online to pay your electricity bill, you deal with images throughout. Yeah? You deal with the image of an electricity company, you deal with the image of your bank, you deal with the image of your money. And these are all images. And then the electricity that you pay for comes back to your house and powers more images. And also some things which are not images. But where the image begins and where the image ends seems to be one of the most crucial questions for the modern age. So I will leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, the task now is to find the blind spot. Would anyone like to have a go?
Yeah, can I ask, but when you're talking about this religious frame for the Middle Age, there's like two choice for the people, it's in or out. If you don't believe God, you're out, you know, you physically may be killed or whatever, so you can't, you have to believe God, right? So that's kind of...
Why do you think there is in and out? Why do you think there is a possibility not to believe in God?
Well, you said that's the frame, right? The frame
Yes.
is some... What is frame? How you define framework?
The frame is the ground.
Yeah.
Is the ground that you sit on.
There's a limit. You mean that you can't go underground?
It is a limit, but it is. That is the frame. That it's the frame gives meaning to everything inside it. Yeah, stepping out of a frame is possible to some extent. It's possible to step out of language. Yeah, but it is very, very difficult. Yeah?
Yeah.
And you cannot do it with media studies. You cannot do it with illustration. You can sometimes do it with philosophy, because philosophy is precisely the discipline that attempts to think the conditions of thinking. Yeah? But to your question about the Middle Ages, how do you imagine someone getting up and saying, I want to step out of this frame? Then what? Then what do you know?
And then, you know, I will imagine, you know, you get less for what you're invested than other people who invest God. They get more than you get, right?
Well, think about it in this way. Is it possible for us here to step out of capitalism?
That's what I'm asking. You know, when you define how you like to do a photo, you put a frame or you not put a frame. That frame is a square, right? You only give me two choices. You put a square, it's a triangle or square, I don't mind, it's something like that shape you put on there, or you don't put that there. But
can you have an image without a frame?
Well, I can have an image without frame if I'm thinking there's something more fundamental than the frame is. When I'm thinking about this framework, you know, why the house is square, everything is square, the screen is square, you know, your chair is square. I think it's because, like when you're educated, you know, when you're religion people, you are educated, but when you're born in a child, in this world, we have a gravity, we have physics, so everybody has to fix. So,
well, maybe this will help. What I'm calling framework, following Heidegger and Deleuze, Antonio Gramsci calls hegemony.
what does it mean?
Hegemony is, it's just the things that we take to be completely natural. Yeah. For instance, just as it is sort of natural that you sit here and I'm standing there, and no one questions it. Just as it's natural, for instance, that the Houses of Parliament have these leather sofas and wood paneling, and not the Formica tables from McDonald's. Yeah. Why? That's just how it is. That's how it's supposed to be. Yeah. So it's quite natural that if you, let's say, come to the Houses of Parliament and you live on a council estate, you feel very intimidated. But if you come from a university like Oxford, then you feel, oh, that's quite nice. I feel right at home. Yeah. That is a kind of a framing that is just there, and it's very difficult to question. Yeah. So Gramsci calls it hegemony.
I think that when you say it's quite difficult to question these natural things because the natural is the result, it's not the reason. It's a result of some reason because some people found it's comfortable.
The reason is the frame.
So what's the frame for this frame? What's the framework?
Okay, Stephen, your last... It's fine. Go on, finish your last question.
Yeah, the last question, my real question is, how is the framework for we have to put a frame?
Well, I think the discourse we are having now is framing this.
with respect to, I'd just like to open it up to other people. So, Vika, did you have your hand up?
Thanks, Daniel. I think, in this context, as much as I understand Deleuze and as much as I understand this idea of deconstruction, I would like to ask you what you mean by representation, because my possibly very image-led understanding of representation, coming from the Latin, means standing in for. Standing in for means there's a question of likeness or not likeness, which I'm very happy to run with, because I'm very interested personally in questions of unlikeness. So where are we getting then if we are going with this idea of standing in for, when the image is not really about representation in the way of what's happening there, but what you call indexicality, which I would always talk about as something that might have shifted meaning anyway. Yeah, if we say there is a difference between the image and the world because it has shifted already and doesn't need to shift in order to us to break that chain of meaning. So how are you getting away from dualism if you're not talking about representation as standing in for?
Well, representation is a standing in. Yes, you're right. But it's a technology of standing in.
Not necessarily. It can be simply a linguistic thing. It can be a sculptural thing. It doesn't need to be flat. It can be anything that is
So do you think
to represent something else?
So do you think representation is God?
Why would you say something?
Because it's just there.
No. It's an act.
Yeah.
So it's a choice.
So if it's an act, then it's a certain style, isn't it?
I wouldn't go with style, but I would defeat the idea of the frame. And I know how Deleuze and Guattari argue for that, but just bringing it back to your own very theory of kind of like rethinking photography, I'm not sure if you need that idea of the frame.
The frame is just a very handy way to get into the discussion of how representation operates. Representation operates by framing.
I don't think so, because if you take a sculpture,
yes,
it's not being framed. Yeah, if I make a wonderful Daniel that stands in for you being there, then it hasn't got a frame.
But it does though. It's the sort of biological extent of what your eyes can, if this is a frame.
But that's a very simplistic, a bit biological, deterministic idea of understanding, a representation of something, which can be in the mind, in whatever. It doesn't really need that literalism.
I understand that. Sorry.
Can we I was going to say to this example of sculpture is that it's exactly the critique of Kant is in his Paragon definition of the frame is taking the sculpture as a second example of framing. And Derrida is criticizing in his Truth in Painting exactly that notion of not perceiving sculpture as being unframed.
Well, I think, just to maybe answer very, very, very briefly, this understanding of representation which I brought in is taken essentially, its philosophical genealogy is Kant. For Kant, representation is how the world can be known. The world itself is unknown. All that can be known about the world is its representations through the categories. But Heidegger then takes issue with this approach, and he really positions representation as the malaise, as the disease of the Western mind. And he identifies the whole split that happens in Western thought around about Plato. It kind of takes on this representational turn, but this turn then gets deeply ingrained and made into modern way of living through Descartes. So that's, if you ask where I get it from, that's where I get it from. This is it's quite a journey, and in this way of thinking, representation is understood. This is the way by which the world is given as a picture. So you are right. It is about taking something and representing it. How it's done is a certain technology which has its anchorage in the rational mind, in the rational project.
Would you be interested in getting rid of the frame I mean, Levinas has this notion of the human secreting imagery, and it's this sense in which the kind of ontological expression of a thing can be image-based, which does away with the frame in some sense. It's a different kind of continuity. Would you be happy with
Absolutely,
that?
and you know, I've only presented here the Deleuze-Guattari toolkit for dealing with images. I'm not subscribing to it myself, or at least what I think is kind of completely irrelevant. And there are many other ways of doing these things. I just think, to me, this is a very potent toolkit. It can unlock. The whole question is really not whether it's right or wrong, but whether it can be used. If some of it can be used.
Deleuze is in order to politicize, and I think that is
Sorry?
useful. Deleuze writing is in order to politicize.
Not.
I think that is useful.
Not politicized.
No, to do politicize,
yes,
I
yes.
think that is useful. But it doesn't really tell you much about, say, the face. It doesn't tell you much about, it only tells you much about how it's being used and how it can be politicized and rethought. But in a way, it's kind of like thinking about it in the wrong direction if you want to bring it back to something. It's not, you know, they're using it in order to destroy something, but in a way we are kind of like trying to rethink it from the other direction, isn't it?
Do we? I don't know. Who are we?
You in this case, because that's what you put up.
Well, first, you know, Deleuze-Guattari have a whole chapter about the face in Thousands of Those, which I think is anyway. I think you're right in bringing it up, but it is. I think what is important here is that they offer a way of dealing with an image which is not based on idealistic presuppositions. Yeah, that what is productive, especially pertinent for photography, because it's been sort of carrying this unexamined burden of idealism for obvious reasons, yeah, but for a very long time. Art somehow managed to excavate itself from this thing, and art learned to be abstract and non-representational, and to deal with the notion of art just being, you know, and creating an event rather than a representation. So what will it take for photography? What tools we can gather to allow photography to be an event rather than an image of an event? And I suggested that these three little journeys are possible tools to achieve that. Paul?
Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
Wonderful talk. When you were talking, I just was reminded of a concept in Deleuze's book, Proust and Style, where he uses the phrase image of thought.
Yes.
And it's such a sort of beguiling concept. I've always enjoyed it, but you reminded me that I hadn't really thought about it properly. So I wonder what your thoughts
Well,
are on image of thought.
this is a wonderful chapter, and he gets into the same question in the third chapter of Difference and Repetition, which is also called Image of Thought. And I think this is a great question, but we don't have much time to get into it. Very briefly, for Deleuze, the question is, what does it mean to think without taking for granted this connection that thought is a representation of truth? Yeah, how to untangle these things? Now, it is possible. Deleuze says, well, it's possible to fantasize at least that in the future we will be able to have an imageless thought, a thought that is just the event of thinking, not based on this rationalist connection between thought and truth. I want to suggest that this invisible image could be a really good ground for a thought that wants to start from something very specific, very anchored in the process, which not necessarily deals with a visual image, because that brings the whole Trojan horse of text, semiotics, structuralism that we don't want to bring into thought.
It might lead into affect then, maybe.
Yeah, and this latent image is pure affect. It's pure affect, and yet it is not meaningless. But it's a kind of meaning that has no semiotic content. Katrina? Hello.
Kind of feel a bit like Neo, who's been asked whether he wants to take the red pill or the blue pill today. Doing that. But my question is, given that there's a room full of practitioners here, what does the practice of a photographer who steps outside of representation look like?
Well, I think I just performed it to you for an hour, so I'm surprised at this question.
No, pin it down, please.
That was the practice of a photographer who steps out of the presentation. However, I did promise to myself, so 1 second, I did promise to myself that there will be no references to the Matrix or the Blade Runner in this talk. So I would like to keep it that way, please. Yes. What did you say, Daniel?
I think your talk, though, does rely on the very representational images used in a very kind of basic image text, kind of semiotic way to illustrate the ideas and represent the ideas that you're talking about.
As I said,
the performance of non-representational photography kind of hinges on the visuals of very representational photography.
That's a good point, Daniel. And as I said in the beginning, you just have to live with it. The thing is, no, the serious answer is that getting out of representation does not mean leaving representation and setting camp somewhere else, because that will just erect another edifice of representation in a new location. People like Edwards and Hart did that in their book on the materiality of photography. No, the point is to follow Lyotard's lead in libidinal economy, when he says, we are not moving anywhere, comrades. We are staying right there in the sign. We excavate the affect, the non-representational, in the sign itself. We're not moving anywhere from the photographic image. We find the non-representational within the image, not outside of it.
Just echoing Katrina's question, are there any contemporary artists who you think deal with the photographic in an interesting way?
Well, I showed a few of them. I think. Well, they probably. It's just like with theory of photography. The most interesting theory of photography are those books that don't say a word about photography. Gottfried Leibniz's Monadology is a fascinating book about photography, and so is Heidegger's essays on questionable setting technology. And they will teach you much more, and even Marx' Das Kapital, they will teach you much more about photography than books that take photography as a given and go and write these kind of all these post-colonial discourses. I think this is a work of art that says something about photography in a very meaningful way, and that shows a kind of possibility. But that to me is really the quintessential photographic image, because it captures the exposure itself. It allows us to realize that our obsession with the image is a very one-sided way to look at photography. Because, for instance, think about music. Okay, so you have the whole polyphonic, harmonious music, inherited from the Renaissance, and all these fugues and symphonies. Okay, but then someone comes and makes atonal music, yeah, in which the sounds don't follow a predefined representational structure of harmony, but they just kind of take you to different places. So it's not about each individual sound being part of a scale, but just like a jack-in-the-box, taking you to a different place. Now, why photography cannot discover its own atonal moment, in which it's not the image that matters, but the image is just a platform from which you go to the next one. And that's it. And it's not about the content, but the going to the next one already has a certain rhythm to it, because it's affective, it involves the body. And just going with this rhythm creates a certain meaning and a certain experience, which has nothing to do with the content.
Daniel.
Yes, Andrew.
Yeah. I mean, it's just really interesting that you start with Rathenberg, because what you just said suggests that you're looking for a kind of modernist version of photography, which doesn't really get us around the problems of the crisis of representation. There seems to be a conflation in your talk between a kind of philosophical interest in the ontology of photography, and really, the first hour of your talk could have just been pure McClellan, really, in terms of just thinking about photography as a medium, removed of content. And then I can never square that up with the fact that you took us on a very interesting, elliptical kind of account of Western culture, but you want to remove culture and language from anything to do with the photograph.
Yes.
How do you put those
Well, first,
we'll all go away thinking, you know, Rauschenberg is the image of photography, because if that's the case, then all we're left with is a kind of empty modernist formalism.
Yes. Well, first, regarding McLuhan, I think you are correct. McLuhan rewrote Heidegger for the masses, and for that reason, if you recognize some McLuhan overtones here, it is for a reason. I'm interested in people like Rauschenberg and Malevich and others, not because they are modernists. I actually consider that a postmodern work, because postmodernism is that which comes before modernism, not after. Postmodernism is that which makes modernism possible. And modernism, I think, never really happened. Okay. But in these works, we do get the sense of what it's like to go beyond the content, to go beyond the visual or beyond the linguistic. And the reason I'm interested in removing, let's say, language and content from photography, because language and content necessarily bring with it a hierarchical structure. So it's just curious to see how is it possible to use photography not in order to reaffirm existing, solid, externally given frameworks, but in order to make something which is just more spontaneous, more kind of emerging and becoming, and without this whole edifice of rationality or logic behind it.
Unfortunately, we have to stop there, but thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Daniel.
Okay.